This festival is entirely staffed by hardworking volunteers who really want to keep these events free for the public. So if you are at all inspired, please donate in that lovely lucite box back by the door or send us a check. We would so appreciate your help. This portion of the afternoon is, once again, Vermont Voices, where we find wonderful writers in Vermont, and it is sponsored by the New England Review out of Middlebury College. So thank you very much for coming. Robin MacArthur received an MFA in fiction from Vermont College of Fine Arts and a BA from Brown University. She earned 2 creation grants from the Vermont Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. She is the author of Half Wild Stories and the editor of Contemporary Vermont Fiction from Green Writers Press. Good writing makes you see the world differently, and it's especially magical when that world is your own neighborhood. MacArthur's sense of place is so powerful and her prose so evocative, I feel I've known her characters my whole life. Characters wrenched by the threat of exile, trying to hold on to a life that has already begun to vanish. Please give a very warm welcome to Robin MacArthur.
Thank you, my neighbors. This is such a treat to be part of the literary festival this year. I write, but I mostly just hole up in my house in the woods and hang out with my kids. So I never feel that connected to a literary community. And so when the festival comes to town every October, it just feels like this spiritual pilgrimage that I go on. And usually I sit in the back row and I kind of scratch notes about what I want to write and get inspired and never introduce myself to anybody. And it's been really fun to be part of it this year with my own book. So I'm delighted and grateful, and thanks to Stephanie for organizing the Vermont Voices. That's wonderful to celebrate this state that has so many writers in it. So Half Wild, a lot of you know me. This is my book it's set in a fictional town in Southern Vermont, which is based on the towns west of here, Marlborough, Jacksonville, Wardsboro, kind of the more wooded, less populated, can you all hear me? Back up? Less populated towns of Southern Vermont. It's kind of, Eudora Welty says that one place understood helps us understand all places better. And so it's my investigation of this place, but really an investigation of all places and how multifaceted they all are. And a short story collection is the perfect structure to explore that. You can inhabit all these different voices who see the same place differently. So it's a book that I knew I wanted to write since I was 20, maybe 18. And I wrote a whole bunch of stories for 10 years that did not make it into here, and then I started writing the ones that did make it into here. But they were all the same. They were all the other ones that did not make it in were drafts of this book that I wrote for. So I spent 8 years writing this and another 10 writing the ones that did not make it. I am going to read the story Wings, 1989. It's hard to know what to read in your hometown. But this one is one of the more autobiographical stories, although for those of you who know my parents, you'll know that these are not my parents. But there are aspects of these characters who are like my parents, and I did grow up with broken down Datsuns and cellars full of canned goods, and surrounded by the hills that my dad grew up on, and with a mom who was from elsewhere. And it's the character Katie in this story is a girl who grows up here, wants to be a writer, doesn't ever feel like she could be a writer, and that's very much how I felt, and how I've felt every literary festival before this one. And when I'm at these author events, everybody who asks questions, so many people who ask questions clearly are aspiring writers, and I just think if you're out there, take heart and write your books. That day in July, my mom came out of the house, wiped her soapy hands on her thighs, and told me to get my lazy bum up off the grass and go weed the peas. She wore rolled-up blue jeans, a plaid cotton blouse, and a red bandana that tied her dark hair back from her face. Her toenails were caked with dirt and needed cutting. "Don't want to," I said. My dad had been gone on a job for a week, and it was just the two of us. In the sun, the temperature read 90, bugs swarmed around my skin, and flies landed intermittently on my thighs and knees. "Katie, how'd you get to be so lazy?" I do have a farming mom, and I am lazy. She said, squinting off toward the hills that used to belong to my dad's parents but had since been sold, and then started walking alone through the tall grass down to the garden. I watched her shoulder blades moving under her blouse and went back to the library book I was reading. It was about a girl who lived in a clean house in the suburbs with lots of rooms and windows. The girl wrote stories, and the book was about those stories she wrote and all those windows. I wanted to be like her, unencumbered, surrounded by light. In one story, she wrote about girls who turned into birds, hawks and ravens and buzzards and crows. They could fly anywhere they wanted to go. You knew reading that the girl who wrote the stories was free, too. You could feel it in your bones, but I couldn't concentrate anymore with my tired mom walking down to the garden alone. I felt a trickle of sweat slip down my spine and thought about those weeds, tall, green, stringy, crowding out the tomatoes and peas and carrots and beans. I thought about our basement full of empty canning jars collecting dust and our Datsun with a busted starter. After a few minutes, I got up and went down the hill too, knelt in front of the carrots and pigweed. My mom didn't say a thing, just looked at me sideways for a moment and smiled, then went back to the peas. We lived in a house that didn't have many windows, just a few small double hungs in each room that we covered with plastic in winter. My dad had built the house when he was 20, a pine-sided cabin with 2 bedrooms and a porch, and a barn where he had hoped someday to keep goats or horses. Now that barn was just a place with no walls where we kept snow tires and broken lawnmowers and old chairs in need of caning. The weeds were thick and everywhere, pigweed and witchgrass and dandelion. It had rained all of June, and standing water pooled in between the rows, and mosquito eggs floated around in the pools. But that day was all sun. My hair fell into my face and stuck to my cheeks, and the thin brown hairs on my legs shone. Wet dirt wedged under my fingernails and made them throb. The skin on my arms and legs burned. My mom's arms were a nice freckled brown, and she didn't sweat. Mine were my dad's, pink and burnable. "Swing low, sweet chariot," my mom sang, quietly and out of key. She had grown up in a big house in the suburbs, just like the girl in my book, and could have done anything with her life. Back in college, she had wanted to be a poet. There were floppy books of poetry stored on a shelf in the corner of her bedroom, collecting dust, Adrienne Rich and Sylvia Plath. There were old lace bras in her underwear drawer that she never wore. I got up and moved to the grassy shade at the edge of the garden. I lay down and closed my eyes and thought about how a Coke or a blue slush puppy or a sip of my mom's ice-cold wine would feel on my tongue. I could hear her inching along through the rows. I picked a blade of grass and stuck it between my teeth and nibbled on it, let the bitter taste seep all over, and then I spit it out and just lay there, feeling the cool. I had the story of how they met like a movie in my mind. My dad had a job at the local college building storage sheds. It was hot and he worked with his shirt off, and all the girls hung around, my mom told me, pretending to read near where he cut and hammered boards. But she was the only one to offer him a glass of ice water. He said he'd love one, but that swimming was an even better way to cool down. Then he grinned. "Do you like to swim?" He took her to a place in the Silver Creek called Indian Love Call and told her it was named that because Indians would bring their girlfriends there. On one side of the river, a ledge outcrop rose 20 feet above the water, and they carried their towels up to that rock and looked down. The water bristled with snow melt. and the boulders flashed silver in the sun. He beat his fists against his chest and made a hooting call meant to imitate an Indian. His voice echoed back. Then he took off all his clothes and leapt into that water. My mom stood there in her jeans and blouse looking down at him. He crowed and hollered and splashed and looked up at her. She laughed. "What you waiting for?" he called out. "It looks cold," she shouted above the sound of water. "Fresh," he yelled. So my mom took off all her clothes and jumped in too. She'd never been naked in front of a man or leapt off a cliff into ice water. She said she knew right then, in midair, that her life would be something entirely different from what she had imagined. I'm going to skip a little bit. So they make dinner, and the dad comes home. I heard his truck coming up the driveway and went outside. When I was young, we drove that red Ford to Florida and camped in a tent surrounded by pines. We cooked on a Coleman stove, and my mom's skin turned a beautiful brown. There are pictures. There's also a picture I took of the two of them dancing barefoot on the beach at dusk, my mom's neck tipped back, her mouth wide with laughter. My dad hopped out of the truck and came toward me. "There's my beauty," he called out, scooping me up and swinging me around in a circle. His eyes were bloodshot and he was grinning. He set me down and looked at the house. "How's Lynn?" We walked inside together. She didn't look up, just kept chopping her vegetables, the knife making little scratching sounds on the board. "And beauty number 2, he said, quiet, breathing. He went around the counter to where she stood and put his arms around her waist, placed his thumbs on her hip bones. I said, "Hello, beautiful," he said into her ear. Then he looked at me, his eyes glistening. He was stoned, I could tell. I loved him when he was stoned. He talked to both of us this way. My mom stopped chopping her vegetables and closed her eyes. The cotton of her shirt went up and down with her breath. Then she pushed him away with her elbow. "Go take a shower." So they have dinner, and then the mom goes back inside. The back door slammed, and I went around the side of the house. My mom was going down the hill to the garden in the near dark. She kneeled by the zucchini this time, pulling more weeds, trying to make things right. It was a losing battle, I knew. I followed and stood quiet in the shadows a few yards away. After a few minutes, she stopped weeding and bent over and put her face in her hands. Her shoulders started to shake. I looked at the view and then at my toes and then back at her. The shadows of her shoulder blades started moving around under her skin. The skin of her back stretched out until it was gleaming, nearly translucent. Large pointy things, the length of my legs, began moving around, poking through her ribs and skin. "Mom," I called out, my voice too loud in that dark. She looked up at me, her eyes hazy, viscous blank. Those things on her back were iridescent, dark feathered wings. Then a look of recognition passed through her. "Oh, hi." Those wings disappeared, stopped pulsing there. She had been crying, but she looked beautiful. "Want to help, Kate?" My heart was electric, but I went and knelt next to her. It was the only thing I knew how to do. We pulled until it was so dark we could no longer tell the difference between one thing and another, unearthing spinach and peas and beans. A firefly flew into her blouse and started blinking in there. She laughed and tugged the cotton away from her chest, and the bug flew out. Then she put her arms around me and held me to her. She smelled like dish soap and earth, but something strange and sour that I'd never smelled before, too. All around us, crickets were finding their partners. I thought about my dad up there alone at that table, and how I'd always be like him, wingless, from here. "You cold?" she asked. She started shaking, and I could feel those wings again, behind me, trembling below the surface of her skin. "No," I lied. The night air was warm, but I was freezing. Only where she touched me was I warm. Her breath was sour, uneven, scented with wine. On the horizon, the moon started to come up through the trees, just a sliver, then disappeared behind the tops of the hemlocks and the pines. Thank you.
That was so lovely. Thank you. Jensen Beach is the author of 2 story collections, For Out of the Heart Proceed, and most recently, Swallowed by the Cold. He holds an MFA in fiction from the Program for Poets and Writers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as an MA and BA in English from Stockholm University. He teaches in the BFA program at Johnson State College, where he is the fiction editor at Green Mountains Review. He's also a faculty member in the MFA program in writing and publishing at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. His writing has appeared recently in A Public Space, the Paris Review, and the New Yorker. He's one of the web editors at Hobart. Jack Livings described Benson Beach as a master of linguistic restraint, a writer whose precision, empathy, and relentless honesty form the spine of this extraordinary work of fiction. Taken individually, these stories from Swallowed by the Cold are works of art. It's when the collection is viewed as a whole, however, that an intricate fictional latticework emerges. Each story here is the progenitor of the next, each life therein a quiet catastrophe, each character both victim and witness, bound to every other character in those unknowable ways that bind us all together. This is not just a book, but a world. Please give a warm welcome to Jensen Beach.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. That was a really lovely introduction. And thanks, Robin. I love that story. I'm teaching Robin's book this semester in my fiction workshop. Yeah, I knew her fan club would be delighted. And it's just such a marvelous collection. What an accomplishment. And I really, really love that story in particular, so I'm glad you read it. In honor of this being Vermont Voices, I thought I'd read a story featuring two Germans and set in Denmark. I'm just going to read the end of it, and I think it does take a little bit of setup, and I'll try not to be too boring in the plot summary. This is a story, the story I read last night, part of the first story in the book features a bicycle accident in which a man named Rolf dies. Rolf is the father of the main character in this story, Lennart. And Lennart is newly in a relationship with a former girlfriend of his, and he's in Denmark on his girlfriend's suggestion to sort of rest a little bit and get his shit together, basically. And he meets these German ornithologists who are down in the northern part of Denmark at a migrating sand dune. This sounds really boring in summary, doesn't it? And they are, Annika, the female scientist, admits to Lennart when they're out doing their experiments on the birds that she and Matthias, the male scientist, pretend to be married when they travel together for work. So she gives this frightening admission, and it kind of jolts him a little bit. So I'm just going to pick up about midway through and read to the end. Lennart saw the birds first. A low-slung black cloud shook and pulsed on the horizon. He placed the newspaper in the sand. At first he couldn't tell what he was looking at. The cloud moved as if it were a single body. When one side expanded outward, the opposite side followed, closing any open space. He watched for a moment before it occurred to him that he was looking at a flock of birds. There, he said, pointing. When he spoke, he heard that his voice sounded higher-pitched and unfamiliar. Come closer to the blind so that you don't frighten them, Annika said. Lennart crawled through the sand toward Annika and knelt beside her. The birds approached, and a group split from the flock and landed in the sand all around them. They were taller than the decoys and much more dramatically colored. Some had yellow mixed in with black and gray feathers along their back, and a long S-shaped line of white along the sides of their heads. The birds shook and stepped in short, rapid movements while Matthias and Annika whispered to each other, also moving quickly, and before Lennart knew it had happened, Matthias pulled the line and the net rose straight up into the wind. The net paused at the apex of its arc, and everything seemed to fall silent, and then the wind caught in the net and it clapped down violently. The bird's knot in the net exploded into the air from the sand. He listened to the caught birds trying to flap their wings beneath the net. Soon they stopped struggling, and there was no noise, only the net rising and falling with the birds' heavy breathing. Matthias reached under the net and pulled out the first bird. He spoke softly to it as he lifted it up, held it close to his chest. He turned the bird slowly in his hand and lifted each of its wings. Then he placed a blue plastic tag around the bird's leg and crimped it shut with a pair of pliers. He and Annika took turns removing a single bird at a time, made note of its tag if it had one, fastened their own tag on the bird's leg, performed what Lennart guessed was a brief medical exam, and then released it. This they did by setting the bird down in the sand and waiting for it to fly away. It took a long time to make it through all but one of the birds. 27, Annika said to Matthias, who was approaching the final bird. The bird wasn't moving, and as Matthias got closer, he said something to Annika that Lennart didn't understand. Lennart watched them both to see how he should react. The bird was pinned beneath the pole, the net twisted and knotted around its neck. It's dead, Annika said, without touching the bird to confirm that she was right. Matthias lifted the net and untangled the bird. He held it in both hands, looking down at it for a moment, and walked to a stand of grass and placed the bird behind this. Lennart was surprised at how easy this all seemed, but he didn't know what else he would have expected to happen. That's all, he said. If this was another species of bird, said Annika, or if we knew it was diseased, we would freeze the body to study it later. But plovers are common, and this one appears healthy. What this bird will tell us about the plover population of Northern Europe is only that accidents sometimes happen. Anyway, said Matthias, we don't have the proper equipment to freeze the bird. Shouldn't we bury it? Asked Lennart. No, Annika said. An animal will find the bird and eat it. The rest will decompose. If you bury it in the sand, the bird will rot. Shall we say a funeral prayer too? Matthias said, laughing. Light a candle? Don't listen to him, Annika said. Unceremonious disposal of a dead body is not necessarily an indication of a lack of respect for these birds or for nature. Animals die. This is normal in any ecosystem. We die, they die, it's nothing. Lennart watched the Germans finish their work. They took down the blind and disassembled the net and the poles, neatly packing everything. Lennart helped as he felt he could, but mostly he just watched. He tried not to look at the dead bird. He helped take equipment back to the car, following a short distance behind Annika and Matthias, who seemed to have been energized by the success of the net and their work and spoke loudly about a restaurant they wanted to try in Skagen that evening. They were nearly back to the car when Lennart remembered the newspaper. He helped the Germans load the equipment in the trunk and the back seat, and then he went back for the paper. He walked quickly down the trail, struggling to keep his pace in the sand. Up ahead he saw some birds, gulls maybe, circling above. He reached the place where they'd set up the blind and the net. Some larger birds had landed and were pecking at the plover's carcass. When Lennart got close, the larger birds flew off. Annika had said this would happen, of course, and he knew enough to know that it was natural, but something about the tiny, bloodied body of the bird in the sand bothered him. He kicked some sand at it to cover the body, but this didn't feel right either, so he took the paper and opened it, and picked the carcass up and wrapped it in the paper as tightly as he could. He didn't know what to do after this, so he opened his backpack and placed the bird carefully inside. The Germans were waiting in the car when he got back. When he left the trail for the asphalt of the parking lot, he waved and began to jog, no more quickly than he could have walked, probably, toward the car. Matthias put the car in gear and started driving before Lennart had settled. The door slammed with the momentum. He held his backpack on his lap. Annika, her hand rested on Matthias's shoulder, turned in her seat to look over her own shoulder at Lennart. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked. He hadn't said why he was going back. I left my newspaper, he said. What did you think of the mile? That's the name of the sand dune. It's called the Rogberg Mile. What did you think of the mile, Lennart? Matthias asked. The grasses and the waves of sand were pretty, a little boring, unsurprising maybe. He liked watching the Germans work, though he still hadn't decided whether Annika had been joking about her and Matthias. The joke, or whatever it was, wasn't particularly funny, but given that he didn't know Annika at all, it hardly seemed an honest admission. He'd tried to imagine telling Marie about it, but there wasn't really any way, as far as he could tell, to do so without seeming to betray an intimacy with Annika that he hadn't had. Marie would be curious about the context for such a story, and he knew she'd have the same questions he did about the arrangement, whether it was true or not. There were fewer people than I'd expected, he said finally. We're so far from everything up here, Annika said, one might really do anything at all. On the drive back to the hotel, Matthias and Annika talked more about the restaurant which had been recommended to them. They were going to leave before lunch the next day. He looked at Annika for a sign that she was disappointed about the end of the trip. She'd kept her hand on Matthias's shoulder the whole drive, and when Matthias brought up the return trip, suggesting that they stop for the night in Hamburg on the way home, Annika dropped her hand to his leg and looked away. At the hotel, he helped the Germans take the equipment inside. He carried his backpack and the black plastic case about the size of his chest. He hadn't remembered seeing that case at the mile, but assumed the Germans' work required all kinds of equipment that he hadn't seen in just one day spent with them. They gathered everything in the lobby, close to the elevators. Matthias went back to the car for the last of the things. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun, low on the horizon, shone in brightly through the tall windows. A nicely dressed couple came out of the bar and crossed the lobby. They walked slowly and deliberately around the equipment. Leonard heard the woman ask the man and a woman in a whisper, "Are they making a film, do you think?" The man looked at Leonard and shrugged. He passed very close, and Leonard smelled the alcohol in his breath. The day he'd arrived, Leonard had bought 2 bottles of Japanese whiskey in Friedrichshafen. The first bottle was already empty. He was looking forward to a drink when he got up to his room. When the couple had gone, Annika leaned close to Leonard. She smelled like sweat, but not unpleasantly so. "I know what you did," she said. "I'm sorry," Leonard said. His face got warm, and he looked past her. "I'd only guessed it before," she said, "but I can tell I was right by the way you're acting. You did something with the plover, didn't you?" "I went back for the newspaper," he said, "like I told you." "We can't tell Matthias. I think it's kind of funny, even a little sweet, but he'd be angry. Did you bury it? Is that what took so long?" "Of course not." "What then?" she said. "You don't have it with you." "Of course not," he said again. Annika looked at his backpack and up at Leonard. "We know something about each other now," she said. Matthias came in holding the last of the gear. A bag was slipping from his shoulder. "We were just talking about dinner," Annika said. "He isn't going to join us after all." "It's the last night of your trip," Leonard said. "I'm sure you'll want some quiet before you go home to your family." "Well," Matthias said coolly, "come down for a drink later." In his room, Leonard placed his backpack on the dresser beneath where the television was mounted to the wall. He poured himself a drink and then sat down on the bed with it. He flipped through the television channels, watching short flashes of American sitcoms and Danish news programs and a German documentary film about the plastic garbage patch in the Pacific, several times larger than Switzerland. The narrator said this repeatedly as if it were a precise measurement of size. Leonard got up to refill his glass. He opened the bag and looked inside. The weather forecast was the first thing he saw, a sun and a cloud a single day apart. He reached in and unwrapped the paper and lifted the bird's carcass from the bag. He placed it on the dresser beside his drink. The bird had stiffened a little bit, and the beak was tucked tightly against the body. He lifted the bird and looked at the feathers, stretched each wing out to see how long they were. He turned the body in his hands, mimicking as best he could remember the movements Annika and Matthias had performed earlier. The bird wasn't tagged. He guessed this meant it was probably young, hadn't had the time to get caught. He put it down and picked up his glass. The glass was nearly empty, and this shocked him, though the feeling passed quickly and left a tingle in his chest as if he'd thought he'd lost his car keys or a telephone, and suddenly remembered they were only in his pocket. The body is so much more immediate to all that we experience than the mind. He lifted the glass, held it at eye level, watched the liquid calm, and measured with disappointment how much he'd already had. He finished what was left in one gulp. Early the morning after his father died, he'd received a phone call from the summer house. The police had called the evening before to confirm the death, so he was surprised and a little frightened to see his father's number flash across the screen of his phone early the next morning. The call was from Henrik Brandt, the man who owned the house up the road and nearest a little outcropping of rock his father had always called Bull's Head. Henrik had woken him with the call. It was before dawn. He didn't want anything, and he didn't say why he was in the house. He just apologized for calling so early and told Leonard he was sorry to have heard the news. Leonard didn't know how to respond, so he thanked the man for his concern. It wasn't until later that it occurred to him that the situation was strange. That afternoon, Leonard looked up the number for the Upland County Police Authority and called to report Henrik's phone call. He was transferred to a woman who introduced herself as a case officer in the Norrtälje Police Department. She assured him that the police would investigate the call, but that it was nothing he should be concerned about. When he pressed her on this, insisting he didn't suspect that Henrik was involved in the death, only that it seemed odd that he would enter the house of a person he knew was dead and then call that person's son, the woman said, "People sometimes act in unusual ways following a death." After he hung up, he tried to rest the telephone in its cradle, but was distracted and his hand slipped, and he dropped the telephone to the floor where it broke apart. He spent the afternoon resoldering a wire to the microphone and gluing the plastic casing back together as best he could. Then he called himself from his cell phone several times to check that the microphone on the landline worked. The nature program had ended, and the bird was staring at him. He tried to sip his whiskey, but the glass was empty. He got up and filled it. The bottle was nearly half gone. He looked at his reflection in the small circular mirror beside the television. He hated this hotel. He leaned in and looked closely in the mirror. Even in the dim, shaky light from the television, he could tell his eyes had reddened. He had to do something with the bird. He wrapped it in the newspaper again, sun and clouds facing him. Tomorrow would be more rain. He held the package in one hand, the drink in his other. He was warm in his chest, and the bird weighed nothing at all. He could barely feel it. With the hand that was holding the bird, he opened the door, pulling it until it was wide enough to fit his foot on the crack of light and pull open. The hall was empty. He held the bird close to his chest. Next to the elevator was a shiny brass trash can with a large plastic bowl on top that had once been an ashtray. He would put the bird inside, go back to his room, pour himself another drink, and watch TV until he fell asleep. But before he could, the elevator bell sounded. He heard the car coming to a stop. The doors opened. 3 people stepped out, a man and a woman and a young girl, a family. The woman took the girl's hand and pulled her close out of Lennart's way as they passed. "Excuse us," the woman said. She said this in Danish, but Lennart could hear right away that she was Swedish. He and Marie had talked about taking a family vacation, but it hadn't happened yet. Maybe in the summer they would take the ferry to Åland to go camping. Lennart felt the bird and his drink in his hand and turned to hide both from the family. He smiled at them, got on the elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. He left his empty glass on the floor of the elevator. In the dark under the lip of the bar, one hand rested heavily over its tiny shape. He held the bird on his lap. He ordered a beer and drank it quickly. There was a soccer match on television and a crowd of people there to watch. He kept one hand on the bird. With the other, he scrolled through his phone aimlessly. He hadn't checked his email all week. Marie had written to say she was going to meet him at the train station in Stockholm when he arrived on Sunday. She missed him and hoped that his trip had been calming. He wrote back briefly to tell her that he planned to drive himself to the ferry in Frederikshavn, get on the train in Gothenburg, and be home before Tuva was in bed. It was simple. He hoped whatever choice he made in the morning was just what he told Marie he'd do, or at least something like it. It was late when the Germans arrived. The game was over. Lennart still sat at the bar, the bird on his lap, his hand on the bird. Annika's cheeks were flushed, and Matthias was grinning widely. They approached Lennart, sat on either side of him. Matthias put his hand on Lennart's shoulder and squeezed. "What a surprise," Annika said. "A wonderful dinner, and now this, now you. Here you are." Thanks.
We have some time for questions and answers and conversation, so if you have anything, now's your chance.
So both of our stories are set in locations
Yes.
and linked by place.
They are.
I talked a little bit about why I did that. I'm curious how you chose your location, and did you know that you wanted to write a linked story about that place? Oh yeah. So did you hear my question about writing about place and a collection linked by place?
So it's interesting that you asked that question because I was having a conversation with a writer last night at the dinner about how there's like the answers that you get really good at giving in like interviews or you know what I mean, and this is one of them. Partly I think, well, the other part of that of course is that the rehearsed answer is almost never as true as like what's underneath that. But for me, so the stories are all set in Sweden where I lived for a while, and two of my kids were born there. My wife is Swedish. We speak Swedish at home. I have a Swedish passport. Like in a lot of ways, I'm a part of that culture. Like it's part of my cultural identity. And so when I started writing about Sweden, I think part of my project, at least early on in the composition of some of these stories, was to kind of like see what it looked like to be Swedish, if that makes sense. I don't know, that seems sort of precious to say it out loud, but I think that's really true. And the simplest answer probably is that I started writing these stories when I got to graduate school in 2008. I just moved back to the US from Sweden. We'd been in Europe almost a decade and come home. And I was just homesick. Sweden was the place where I became an adult. I spent the entirety of my 20s basically in Europe, and most of that time in Sweden. And I learned how to pay bills and get a cell phone and do all of the adult things that one needs to do. Had no idea how you did those things here. And I was just nostalgic and homesick, and so I was writing stories to kind of explore a place that I knew well, but at the same time I would always be an outsider too, because that's not my culture. It's not where I'm from. I didn't grow up there. I could speak Swedish perfectly, and I look the part. I always am a little bit on the outside of that, and so the book maybe in part was an attempt to kind of bridge that gap and see what it felt like. And I don't know that I found an answer to that necessarily, but it certainly was the motivating energy to write about place.
I'll just add to that when my grandparents moved here in the 1940s, and my grandmother had grown up in these places where there were these really rich musical communities. And when she moved to Southern Vermont, she just felt incredibly homesick and lonely for those rich musical communities, and felt like she couldn't know this place without knowing the stories of this place.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it's similar. You're in this place that's foreign to you, and so trying to find those stories of the place and the voices of that place.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. There's a story I often tell. The story didn't make it into the book, but I got kind of a little bit obsessed with these collective memory of event. I guess in the U.S. the biggest one is 9/11, of course, but I really like these kinds of things. There was one in 1993 at this air show, at this festival in the middle of Stockholm. A Saab fighter jet was doing tricks. You can watch the video on YouTube. It's really easy to find it. And it stalled and it crashed. And Stockholm is, if you've ever been there, is built on a bunch of islands. It's really pretty densely populated. And just by luck of it being Scandinavia, right, the plane happened to crash on the one island where no one lived, and no one was hurt. This was 1993, so at that time I would have been 15, 16, and a lot of my friends in Sweden were at this thing and witnessed that, and I wasn't. And so I've seen the video of it on YouTube, I've talked to people who were there, and they all sort of remember it differently, and I guess I kind of got excited about this notion of what does it mean to collectively experience a story and have a memory, and is that the thing that makes a person a part of a culture in a way? I don't know. You know what your grandmother would say about that in terms of music.
Yeah. Yes.
It seems to me that both Kate and Leonard have this unease about them, this sense of displacement. And I think that's what makes art, is we're all a little bit, antsy. Yeah. And if I hadn't read the stories, I would have maybe supposed that Leonard was not Swedish, because he's always a little bit a fish out of water with these two hotshot scientists who are so casual about the lover and so forth. So, beautifully done.
It might be what makes artists is their unease in the world, and so they're then drawn to writing about characters who never quite know where they belong, or are always belonging to two worlds, or that unease, unsettled feeling.
Now, when you mentioned, when you were talking about your story, that the character of Kate wants to be a writer, do you identify more or less with certain characters in the book?
I would say the stuff in there about Kate wanting to be a writer is pure autobiography. That is, I read a book about this girl who lived in the suburbs who was a writer, and all of her emotions about that are my emotions about that. Yeah. And so of all the characters in the book, she's the closest. And then also in The Women Where I'm From, the girl who's returning home, and all of my emotions about returning home when I was I lived in New York, Providence, in New York, and Philadelphia, and traveled, but I had this cabin on my parents' land that I would come back to. And I, like her, she says, there's two places I'll never belong, home or any other. And that's how I used to feel for 20 years of my life. And now I think maybe once you have kids in a place, then you feel like you belong there. I don't feel the angst that I used to feel about home, and that so many of the characters in this book feel about home, but I felt it when I was writing this. So I'm now working on a novel, and there's none of that, because it's just that's not an emotional thing for me. It's not a truth that I'm feeling. Yeah.
Robin, it's a question for you, but also for Jensen as well. Before you started your story, you said something to the effect that these really aren't my parents. And one of the things that I can only imagine must be a real interesting maybe opportunity, but also tricky thing for a writer is to write intimately about a region that they're a part of, that their family is a part of, that has family members in it, that has friends in it. What do you do with friends and family who who might ask you, is that me? Has that been an issue for either of you? With how do you respond to that?
Yeah. I was very aware of that risk. So the people in the book most people are not based on any one person. Most people are just a mashup of all the people who I've known here my whole life. But there are some characters or incidents that are true. And so those people read the book before anybody else. And I went to those people with the book and said, this is my love story. This is to you and to this place. This is, so I've already, the book is getting published. I didn't show it to people before it was published because I didn't want to, it's my art, but I did approach people and say, I'm telling this little fragment of your story, but I do it from a place of love. And I'm hoping for your blessing. And everybody gave their blessing. So, and my parents, there's all these mothers and daughters in here. And a lot of people assume, who don't know my parents very well, but know them peripherally, assume I'm writing about my mother or my dad. Fortunately, my mom is one of the least sensitive people I've ever met, and I say that in a good way. Like she just thinks it's funny, and thinks it's funny that people wonder whether she has a tattoo of a catamount on her thigh. So she just finds it thrilling, and
Does she?
she does not. Oh. No. And I forget where else I was going to go. Yeah, my mom does not have any tattoos.
Yeah, but I'm not really basing it. I mean, I guess like a little bit like Robin, the people are sort of they're all mashed together with people that I know. There's a lot of my father-in-law in the book, weirdly, in some of the older characters in particular. I think he's kind of a funny dude, and I like to make fun of him, and so maybe that was part of the project here. There's a lot of me in the book, and a lot of impulses that I think I recognize in myself that I don't always act on, but maybe would express themselves in really unfortunate ways in some of the things that the characters in this book do. I think that's probably true for every writer. There's that quote, I think it's a Ray Carver quote, where he says something like, "You are not your characters, but your characters are you," or maybe it's the opposite of that. And it's true. I mean, these characters are kind of awful, and we all have those potentials, I think. Yeah.
I wonder if either of you would like to say anything about your literary predecessors or models, any artists that you particularly like or identify with.
Sure. Okay. Want me to start?
So I read American contemporary short story or 20th century and contemporary short story writers pretty obsessively for 8 years, and then much earlier, 20 years before that, read Faulkner pretty obsessively. Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor. I've just always loved writers who are haunted by place and obsessed with place. So those are the people who I kind of learned how to write from, and then read their the people who learned how to write from them pretty obsessively. So Annie Proulx and just all the American place-based writers I have learned a lot from. Yeah, and I sometimes will write a sentence and just laugh at how much I'm imitating Faulkner, some long sentence. I was like, wait a minute, sounds overly familiar. Let me make that a little more my own. So, yeah.
Yeah, I have maybe a pretty similar background, actually. I think as I was growing as a writer, particularly around the time I was getting interested in an MFA, which is not a thing I even knew existed. Like when I was in my 20s, I had no idea that. I just thought writers like got lucky and wrote a book and published it, and then you were famous and rich. I know, right? It's surprising that it took me that long to be dissuaded from that fantasy. I didn't know that like the academy was something you could go into, for example. I had no idea that there was a thing called an MFA, and that's what most professors did in creative writing. But once I started down that path, I think like Robin, I was reading just a lot of contemporary writers pretty obsessively. I've always been drawn to humor. I liked George Saunders. I liked Dennis Johnson's stories. I love Joy Williams. Flannery O'Connor is another writer that I really liked a lot. And then right around the time I started writing this book, the stories in this book, I got kind of obsessed with two writers in particular. One's a Swiss writer named Peter Stam, and the other is a Swedish writer who died in April of this year named Lars Gustafsson. He was a philosophy professor in Texas, and his book, Stories of Happy People That Are Not Happy, was really formative for me, and the rest of his work is equally great, but that story collection in particular was really inspirational for me in these stories.
I just also wanted to put Marilyn Robinson, Alice Munro, and Louise Erdrich out there, because I read them all obsessively. So those are touchstones, I should mention.
What draws you to the short story form as opposed to the novel?
Well, so I'm writing a novel. For those of you who know Pam Champy, do you know Pam Champy? So when I had my astrological chart read at 25, I said, I think I want to be a writer, Pam. I think I want to write short stories. And she's like, oh, no, you're a novelist. And I thought, no, but I read short stories, and that's what I'm trying to write. And now that I'm working on a novel, I think, oh, Pam was right. Of course. I'm loving the larger form. I don't know if I can pull it off. I have a first draft, and I'm working on another one. But I love the expansiveness of it and being able to linger more with characters. And, what's really interesting, my whole thing is that I live on this land where my dad grew up, where my grandparents lived, where my kids, I live surrounded by extended family. So my sense of the individual, I think, is pretty different than other people's because of that. So many short stories are about an individual and one situation, and I just never find that interesting in other people's stories. Because it's not how I see the world. I see this interconnection and this intertwining, and with a novel you can really portray that time frame and those family relationships and how those are all interconnected. So I'm loving the novel, but it might be terrible. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, I think I've always been drawn to the short story. I can remember in high school, I think we were assigned The Dead, that James Joyce story. It's so great. My students make fun of me because I think I talk about that story every day in class. It's just too perfect to not talk about it. But I don't know that I understood the genre distinctions when I was a young reader. Like I knew that that stories weren't as long as novels, but for me it was just that was the thing that gave me the most pleasure, that kind of like tingling feeling, that you get at the end of having read something. And I slogged through a lot of novels, and there are a lot of novels that I read as a kid that I really liked. I liked reading, but the short story was this like magical space for me as a reader, and then later became that as a writer too. But like Robin, I think I'll always love the story. I love writing stories, love teaching stories, reading stories. But in this book, when the stories began to kind of link together, it's not novelistic in scope necessarily, though I think there is a kind of arc, particularly with the character of Lennart. became drawn to something larger, that I think that the novel can be big and messy and encompassing. And Dana Spiotta said something really interesting yesterday, that writing is like a process of finding solutions. Like, you're presented with a problem and you find a solution to that problem, but the tricky thing is that every solution introduces a new set of problems. And so she was talking about like really kind of craft stuff, like methodology, right? If you decide to write in present tense or past tense, or third person or first person, those solve particular problems, but then they also generate their own problems. And I think the neat thing about a novel is that you can experiment with solutions and problems across different approaches. Like, you can write, oh, this section is written in third person, and this section is written as an epistolary novel, and this stuff's in present tense or whatever. And I think that is really fun for me, because I think I'm getting to that point in my writerly development that I'm just liking experimenting and trying and seeing what happens. And like Robin, the novel I'm working on is fun, but who knows if it's any good. I don't know, but it's there.
I like that I went into it with this attitude of anything's possible. You can throw anything into a novel.
Yeah.
Novels are so cool. You can just like, you read something in the newspaper, throw it in your novel.
Yeah.
And now I have to deal with the consequences of that. It also has to cohere.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Robin, that you've been writing for 10 years, and then you started writing the stuff for the last 8 years that ended up in the novel. And it sounded like, in your short story book, and it sounded like there might have been some stories that you used, and then, but I'm just curious about what was different about the 8 years from the first 10 years, and especially if there are any stories that you then rewrote. What was different about them?
So what's different is that I went and got an MFA. It's just very, very simple. I went 8 years ago, started my MFA program. And so instead of writing a draft of something and then thinking it was terrible and throwing it out, or not knowing how to edit it, or not ever getting feedback, so not ever knowing whether it was worth keeping, I started having feedback and doing concrete editorial work. So that's really, there's like a clear marker in my trajectory. But the women where I'm from, that story, I think I worked on that 6 years before. I think I've been writing that one for 15 years, which is the daughter who comes home and how does it feel to come home. So, and I don't want to keep all of my drafts of things, so I think I've finally thrown them out. But I think I probably have 100 drafts of that story that are radically different and go off in different directions, but it's the same character with the same name and the same mother.
Yeah.
Well, just to follow up on that, Bonnie Jo Campbell yesterday was saying how she, was writing for years and years and years and living in different places, and it wasn't until she came home and was surrounded by the place and the people that she grew up with in formative years that her stories got any good.
Well, that's also when I moved back home. So, yeah, it could be a whole confluence. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I kind of thought when I was in my 20s that in order to write about home, you needed to live elsewhere, in order to have this kind of mythological sense of it that wasn't too wedded to reality, and also to feed off of your, I was so homesick. And so that generates this urgency and this desire to write. And if you're actually here, do you still have that desire to write about this place, or is it just, the place where your kids go to school and Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. But I think coming home allowed me to, and writing here, I'm really glad I did, because who knows what I might have taken more liberties with. I knew that I would be accountable within my own community. So I knew that if I was going to write something, I needed to feel okay sharing that with my community and, being responsible for it.
So, Robin, I'm just wondering how having become a mom has affected and changed or not changed or enlarged or whatever your writing and your work as an artist.
Yeah. So 8 years ago, I also got pregnant. Kind of a big year. So I wrote a lot of these stories while I was nursing Ava. I wrote a lot of them at 4 a.m., between 4 and 5:30 a.m., which was just some hour that she sometimes slept. When she was an infant and I was writing them, they were really my way back to myself. I wasn't writing for her necessarily. I was writing because I felt like I'd lost myself so entirely. And so this was a way of feeling my own self that could inhabit all these other bodies and do all these other things and not just be on a couch nursing 24/7. But now I'm writing this novel and my kids are older, and so I don't feel that same physical entrapment. And when I started writing my novel, just somebody made a post on Facebook about how you should write for your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And so this novel is about climate change and how we find our solace or our peace within our dire political and environmental state of the world. So I'm writing it very consciously for my children and my grandchildren as kind of like, here's what I was, here's, I don't know, here was my attempt. This was my attempt to make peace in this moment, no matter what the fallout will be. I'm sorry. It's kind of my way of saying I'm sorry. We tried. I don't know. Yeah. How about you? Jensen has 3 kids.
I do. Yeah. For me, I think having kids was the thing that made me serious a little bit as a writer. I mean, I can remember the moment I realized I wanted to be a writer. I know exactly where I was. I used to work as a temp at a Bank of America office in one of their corporate offices in San Francisco on Powell Street, and I was doing data entry. I worked in the fraud department, so my job was to So sometimes I got to review ATM videos of people putting in empty envelope deposits. I mean, it was so boring, but I mean, maybe a little bit funny now in retrospect. But I was listening to I was listening to the radio, and George Saunders came on, and I talked about him now twice. It's not like he's my favorite writer or anything, but he came on the radio, and he was talking about how when he was in college, he was writing these really, really bad Ernest Hemingway copy stories, and that he even had a character. I can't remember the name of the guy. Do you remember? Have you heard these stories? And they were just really terrible. And he read somebody, I can't remember who it was, and he realized, oh, I can write funny things? I had no idea. And that, for me, that was almost the same kind of moment. It was like, oh, I can write whatever I want. I don't have to worry about writing really serious sort of flowery prose that deals with complicated emotions or whatever. I can write jokes. That's great.
And yet your book is very serious with beautiful prose.
Thanks. It's funny. I read with a Danish writer one time at a reading in Boston, and she sat in the front row, and the entire time I read, she was cracking up. And I also think some of the stories are pretty funny, awkward funny. But she just thought they were really funny, and someone in the audience was like, "I've read your book. I didn't think it was very funny, but now I'm going to reread it and see if there are jokes there." But that was the moment for me, I think. And then having kids, that's when I decided to be a writer, but I had no idea what that meant. And having kids got me serious. It made me think oh God, right? There's a limit to this. I can't just, whatever. So I tried to not waste time, though I'm enormously talented at time wasting.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to move to the back and